The night is absolute. Not dark the way your bedroom is dark. Not dark the way a road goes dark when the headlights cut out. This is the Philippine Sea, December 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor. And the darkness here is something different. It's a wall, a living thing. It presses against your eyes and lies to them, turning distance into illusion, turning open water into solid ground, turning silence into shapes that may or may not be there. The Pacific, at night in 1941, was not a sea. It was a graveyard of shadows. And somewhere inside those shadows, a Japanese destroyer, 2,100 tons of steel, armed with torpedoes and 5-inch guns, is cutting through the water at 30 knots. The crew has no reason for concern. The Americans are shattered. Pearl Harbor still burns. The airfields at Clark and Iba are rubble. Corregidor is running out of time. This is Japanese water now. There is nothing out here that can threaten them. Then somebody hears something they cannot explain. A sound. Low. Mechanical. Not a wave. Not wind. Coming from somewhere in the blackness off the port side. Before anyone can react, a shape tears out of the dark. Barely 60 feet long, impossibly close, white water foaming at its bow, moving so fast it barely seems to touch the ocean. It fires 2 torpedoes at 400 yards and vanishes back into the black wall before the first Japanese gunner can even swing his weapon around. The destroyer swerves. 1 torpedo misses. The second doesn't. The explosion splits the dark like a crack in the world, and out there in the black, the American crew is already gone. Already a mile away. Throttles at the wall, 3 Packard engines screaming at combined 4,500 horsepower, the hull skipping across the surface like a stone thrown by a giant hand. The boat weighs 56 tons. It is made of plywood. Not steel. Not iron. Not reinforced fiberglass. 2 layers of mahogany planking over white oak frames with a layer of aircraft fabric sandwiched between them. Beautiful craftsmanship. And if you put a lit match to it in the wrong place, with all that high-octane aviation fuel sloshing in the tanks beneath your feet, it would burn like a torch on open water, visible for 10 miles. The admirals called them Patrol Torpedo Boats. The Navy called them weapons. The men who bled inside them had other names. They called them plywood targets. They called them wooden coffins. 80 feet of highly flammable fuel and 0 armor. 3 engines that turned the below-deck spaces into furnaces, and a crew of 11 men who understood perfectly well that one bad moment, one lucky shell from a destroyer's gun, and everyone aboard ceased to exist. And on this particular wooden coffin's bow, bolted down with improvised steel mounts welded by a mechanic who had never done anything like it before, sat something that had no business being on a boat at all. The nose gun from a wrecked P-39 Cobra fighter, a 37mm cannon, salvaged from the burning wreckage of Clark Field. The same weapon designed to tear through aircraft cockpits was now pointing forward from a vessel that had no right to exist in the same ocean as a destroyer. The Japanese had a name for these things, not patrol torpedo boats, not PT-34 or PT-41, Oni no Fune, devil boats. This is the story of the smallest, most flammable, most improvised combat vessels the United States Navy ever sent to war. How they were armed with weapons stripped from burning aircraft wreckage. How 6 wooden boats and 27 men became the only offensive naval force left in the Western Pacific after Pearl Harbor. How they terrorized the most powerful fleet in the world, not with superior weapons, not with superior numbers, but with speed and darkness and the particular courage of men who understood perfectly well what they were sitting on top of. and how one of them carried a future president through a shattered hull and 12 hours of open ocean, while the men left behind on Bataan began a march that would kill thousands of them before it ended. If stories like this one are what you came here for, the battles that didn't make the textbooks, the weapons that shouldn't have worked, the men who chose to go out anyway, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is built for exactly this, and there is a lot more coming. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how a wooden boat armed with a dead fighter plane's cannon became the most feared thing in the Pacific night, you first need to understand what the United States Navy thought about small boats in the 1930s. Which is to say, it didn't. The Navy of the interwar years was a battleship institution. The great dreadnoughts, Nevada, Oklahoma, Arizona, Pennsylvania, were the measure of American sea power. Admirals who had grown up in the age of Mahan's naval doctrine believed the decisive engagement of any future war would be fought, ship to ship, broadside to broadside, steel against steel at range. Anything that didn't fit that paradigm was, at best, a footnote in someone's proposal that would never be funded. Torpedo boats were a very small footnote. The concept itself wasn't new. As far back as the 1870s, small fast boats armed with self-propelled torpedoes had been proposed as equalizers, tools for weaker navies to threaten stronger ones. The British built them. The Germans built them. In World War I, German E-boats slipped through North Sea patrols in the dark and proved the concept had genuine teeth. The U.S. Navy wasn't interested. They were the stronger navy. Why would the strongest fleet in the world want weapons designed for the weak? And so, through most of the 1930s, the idea of American PT boats, Patrol Torpedo Boats, existed mostly on paper, inside proposals that never made it past the front desk of anyone who mattered. Two men changed that. Henry Sutphen, vice president of the Electric Launch Company, ELCO, in Bayonne, New Jersey, had watched the British develop their motor torpedo boats and felt the professional hunger of a man who knew he could build something better. In 1938, he commissioned a new design, an 80-foot wooden hull, capable of 40 knots, armed with 4 torpedo tubes, powered by 3 Packard 4M2500 engines. Those engines deserve a moment because they sit at the center of everything that follows. The Packard 4M2500 was a marine adaptation of an aircraft engine, a supercharged V-12 derived from the same mechanical lineage as the Rolls-Royce Merlin that pulled Spitfires through the skies over Britain. Each one produced 1,500 horsepower. 3 of them, in a hull that weighed roughly 56 tons fully loaded, gave a PT boat speeds that larger warships could barely imagine. The boat didn't sail through water. It flew across it. Bow lifting, stern digging in. The hull planing at speeds that made the crew hold on with both hands and pray the sea stayed flat. But those engines ran on 100-octane aviation gasoline, and every PT boat carried between 3,000 and 3,600 gallons of it, distributed through the hull in tanks that were everywhere, beneath everything, under every bunk and every floorboard. The admirals saw the speed figures and approved the design. The men who actually lived aboard these things understood the other number intuitively, the one nobody put in the specifications. Their bunk was 3 feet above a tank of aircraft fuel. Their engine room was a steel compartment containing 3 aircraft power plants running at thousands of revolutions per minute in tropical heat that pushed the temperature past 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell of high-octane gasoline wasn't a background odor. It was as constant as the air itself. It was in your clothes, in your hair. You tasted it when you ate. You smelled it in your sleep. 1 spark. That was all it would take, and everyone aboard was gone. The second man who changed the PT boat's fate was Scott Payne, a British designer who brought his own 70-foot design across the Atlantic in 1939. After competitive trials in Narragansett Bay, the Navy was finally convinced it needed to take this category of vessel seriously. In December 1941, taking it seriously became the only option available. When Japanese aircraft swept Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, the American PT boat force in the Pacific consisted of a handful of experimental craft, several contracts in progress, and one operational squadron, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. 6 boats, 27 officers and men, based at Cavite Naval Station on Manila Bay in the Philippines. The Pacific was a graveyard of shadows, and these 27 men were its only American guardians. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant John Duncan Bulkley, 30 years old, dark-haired, hard-jawed, and possessed of an almost theatrical hunger for combat. His crew called him Wild Man. The Navy would later call him a Medal of Honor recipient. The Japanese, in time, would offer a price for his capture. Bulkley's 6 boats, PT-31, PT-32, PT-33, PT-34, PT-35, and PT-41, were Elco 77-footers, each powered by 3 Packards, each carrying 4 torpedo tubes and twin 50-caliber machine gun mounts, each built from mahogany and plywood over white oak frames, each one a wooden coffin with a throttle. Here's what these 27 men were up against. The Japanese Southern Army and Imperial Japanese Navy had launched coordinated operations across Southeast Asia simultaneously. In the Philippines alone, General Hama Masaharu's 14th Army was landing at multiple points on Luzon. The U.S. Air Force at Clark Field had been largely destroyed on the ground in the first hours of December 8th, Japanese bombers from Formosa catching the American fighters before they could scramble. The Asiatic fleet was withdrawing south. MacArthur was pulling his forces toward Bataan. Bulkley's 6 boats had no air cover, no destroyer escort, no supply line worth the name, no repair facility. Some nights they ran patrols on fuel scrounged from Army air bases, carried to the dock in 5-gallon jerry cans passed across the water by hand, boat to boat, in the dark. What they had was speed, and the darkness. And then, in the rubble of Clark Field, they found something else. When Japanese bombs had finished with the airfield, the tarmac was scattered with wrecked P-39 Airacobras, Bell's distinctive fighter with the engine mounted amidships and a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. Pilots complained bitterly about the P-39's altitude performance. Its supercharger couldn't compete above 15,000 feet. Air commanders were writing it off. Bulkley's mechanics didn't want it for altitude. They wanted it for its nose. A work crew spent 2 days cutting the 37mm cannon assembly from P-39 wreckage, improvising steel mounting brackets from salvaged material, and welding the whole arrangement to the bow of PT-34. No Navy manual covered this. The recoil tolerances were unknown. The mounting wasn't rated for combat loads. 2 enlisted men had to crouch around it in the open, feeding ammunition 1 shell at a time, by hand. It worked. This improvisation, an aircraft weapon bolted onto a wooden boat by men who'd never done anything like it before, was the first and most honest portrait of what the PT Boat War was actually going to be. Not a conflict of gleaming weapons systems performing to specification. A war of salvage, of desperation, of creative stubbornness, fought by men who turned whatever they could scavenge into whatever they needed to survive the next 24 hours. Here is a question I want you to think about seriously. The U.S. Navy knew its standard torpedoes had reliability problems before the war began. They sent these boats out anyway, with those torpedoes, with those engines, with zero armor, because there was nothing else. What do you call it when a government sends men to die with weapons it already knows don't work? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm reading every single one. Between December 1941 and January 1942, Bulkeley's squadron conducted what may be the most audacious sustained naval campaign of the Pacific War's opening weeks. They had almost nothing, and they went out every single night anyway. The engine rooms were ovens, temperature regularly exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 Packards radiating heat that soaked through the deck plates and made the men above them sweat through their clothes before they'd even cleared Manila Bay. The roar of those engines at full throttle wasn't something you heard so much as something you became. It moved through the wooden hull, into the soles of your boots, up through your legs, into your chest, rattling your teeth and your thoughts with the same frequency. You couldn't hold a conversation. You couldn't hear a warning shouted from across the cockpit. You communicated in hand signals and in the shared understanding of men who'd run the same routes enough times to know what the other person was thinking before they thought it. Salty air and gasoline. That was the smell of the PT boat war. Every meal tasted of it. Every piece of clothing carried it. Men who served for months said they couldn't get it out. One mechanic wrote home to his wife in Michigan and said he wasn't sure he'd ever smell anything else again. Bulkeley's rules of night fighting developed through experience that no training had prepared anyone for. Attack from downwind, so engine noise doesn't travel to the target first. Come in on a low approach, using the target's silhouette against whatever sky there is. Never fire torpedoes beyond 1,000 yards. The ideal range was inside 600. That meant closing to within 1/3 of a mile of a destroyer carrying 5-inch guns before giving yourself away and committing to the attack. It wasn't just a sea out there in those Philippine straits at night. It was a wall of black ink where your eyes lied to you constantly, where open water could be a reef, where a shape on the horizon could be a destroyer or a cloud or nothing at all. The only thing reliably real was the vibration of the Packards beneath your feet. On the night of January 19th, 1942, PT-34 and PT-35 intercepted a Japanese cruiser in Benanga Bay. Bulkeley closed to 800 yards. He fired 2 torpedoes. The first struck amidships. The explosion was visible for miles. Both crews reported it independently. Secondary detonations followed from below the waterline. The target, later assessed as the 5,700-ton Japanese light cruiser Kuma, began to list badly. PT-34 turned, pushed all 3 throttles to the wall, and was a mile gone before the first Japanese searchlight swept the bay entrance. For this engagement and the campaign his squadron sustained through those opening months, John Bulkeley would receive the Medal of Honor. But his most important mission hadn't happened yet, and it wouldn't involve torpedoes at all. It would involve one passenger, one man the Japanese wanted more than any other American alive. But before we get there, we need to stop, because the story of this war isn't just about Bulkeley. It isn't just about admirals and commanders and presidents. It's about the men nobody names. Motor machinist's mate Douglas Houlihan, 22 years old, from Providence, Rhode Island. He spent the first 3 months of the Pacific War in a PT boat engine room in the Philippines. The oven beneath the deck, hands permanently black with oil, keeping 3 aircraft engines running on a vessel that had no right to be in combat waters. He contracted malaria in January 1942. He didn't report it, because reporting it meant leaving his boat short an engine room man, and leaving his boat short a man might mean the boat didn't come back. So he sweated through the fever between patrols. Torpedo man's mate, Leon Bales, 20 years old, from a small town in Georgia who had never seen salt water before the Navy showed him some. By March 1942, he had lost 18 pounds. The whites of his eyes had gone slightly yellow from the medications. He wrote home to his mother that the food was not great. His shipmates were swell guys, and he was doing fine. He was shaking from fever when he wrote it. He went out on the next patrol anyway. These were the men in the wooden coffins, not heroes from a poster, not men carved from the material of movie characters. Sick men, hungry men, men whose hands trembled and whose eyes hurt from staring into dark water night after night. They went out because the job had to be done, because the men next to them were going, because there was nothing else to do. Hold that image, because everything that follows only means what it actually means if you hold that image. If you've never seen a channel like this before, a channel that stops to say the names of the men history forgot, hit subscribe right now. These stories only survive if someone tells them, and we are just getting started. By February 1942, Bataan was past critical. It was dying. General MacArthur's combined American and Filipino force, roughly 78,000 men, was jammed onto a peninsula they couldn't hold and couldn't leave, on half rations since January. Malaria ripping through formations with an efficiency that Japanese artillery couldn't match. Men who had started the campaign at full fighting weight dropping to 130 pounds, 120 pounds, fighting fevers that came in waves, shivering in tropical heat, too sick to sleep, but too exhausted not to try. These weren't abstractions. They were 18-year-old boys from Ohio and Alabama, and the mountains of Luzon who had been told relief was coming, told the Navy would break through, told to hold on just a little longer. They held on. The relief didn't come. Washington had made a calculation in the cold mathematics of global war. The Philippines could not be reinforced in time to matter. The Army, the Navy, the ships, and the aircraft. Everything was needed elsewhere. Bataan was a lost cause. And in war, you don't spend assets on lost causes. But MacArthur was not a lost cause. He was a political and military asset the administration could not afford to lose to a Japanese prison camp. Roosevelt sent the order. MacArthur was to leave the Philippines, reach Australia, and take command of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur resisted. To leave his men felt like abandonment. Because it was. Historians have argued about his conduct through this period for 80 years, and haven't settled it. There are those who say he obeyed a direct presidential order under impossible circumstances, and had no realistic choice. There are those who say a different kind of man would have found a way to stay. Here's what I want you to weigh in on. MacArthur left 78,000 men on Bataan, got on a PT boat, and reached Australia to take command of a larger theater. Was that leadership, or was it survival disguised as duty? Drop your honest answer in the comments. No wrong answers. I want to know how you see it. On the night of March 11, 1942, 4 PT boats left Corregidor at dusk with their running lights off. PT-41, under Bulkley himself, carried MacArthur, his wife Jean, his 4-year-old son Arthur, the boy's nurse Ah Chu, and 17 senior officers. The plan was to run 560 miles south through Japanese-controlled waters to Mindanao, where Army B-17s would fly them to Australia. The sea didn't cooperate. Heavy swells kicked up within the first hour, 6 to 8 feet, which on a 77-foot wooden boat feels like driving a car across boulders at full speed. MacArthur and his staff were thrown against the cockpit walls, soaked within minutes. Jean MacArthur locked her son under her arm and didn't let go through the night. The general, according to his aide Sidney Huff, sat in the open cockpit with spray coming over the bow in sheets, and said almost nothing for hours. Just sat there, watching the black water. Whatever was going through his mind stayed there. The 4 boats separated in the darkness and the chop. At 3 in the morning, one boat's engine failed. At sea, at night, in waters where Japanese destroyers were known to patrol. Repairs were made by hand in total darkness by mechanics working from memory, from feel, from the particular expertise of men who had been keeping these engines alive through impossible circumstances for 3 months. At least twice, Bulkley changed course to avoid shapes on the horizon. Shapes that might have been destroyers. Shapes that in that black wall of Pacific night might have been nothing. Nobody slept. Dawn on March 12th found PT-41 at Tagawayan Island, battered and low on fuel. The B-17s in Mindanao turned out to be old, unserviceable, or committed elsewhere. 3 more days passed before reliable aircraft could be arranged. MacArthur reached Australia on March 17, 1942. He gave the press the statement that would define the next 3 years of the Pacific War. I came out of Bataan, and I shall return. The men he left on Bataan surrendered on April 9, 1942. 75,000 of them, American and Filipino, began a march to prisoner-of-war camps that historians have studied for 80 years and still can't fully account for. Between 6,000 and 18,000 of them died before the march ended. From execution, from starvation, from deliberate brutality. Thousands more died in the camps. Bulkley's men knew some of those soldiers, had shared cigarettes and rations and complaints at Cavite before the bombs fell. They heard the news through whatever channel still carried news in the spring of 1942. They didn't talk about it much. They went out on the next patrol. The intelligence from coastwatcher networks that PT boats sustained shaped the timing and targeting of dozens of critical airstrikes. The disruption of Tokyo Express runs that had seemed unblockable before October 1942 was never fully reversed after PT boats arrived at Tulagi. The 20 minutes the 39 boats bought at Surigao Strait gave Oldendorf's battle line the setup it needed. And the 3 battleships resurrected from Pearl Harbor mud that destroyed the Japanese Southern Force, they were there because the PT boats had kept the strait open long enough for them to take position. The Japanese called them Oni no Fune, devil boats. The Americans called them Wooden Coffins, plywood targets, called them by the numbers painted on their hulls with the quiet ownership of men who had decided that if you were going to die in something, you might as well name it properly. John Bulkley came home a Medal of Honor recipient and a national hero. He continued serving in the Navy for decades, retiring as Vice Admiral in 1988 at the age of 76 after 54 years of service. He died in 1996. In his final years, he was still angry about the faulty torpedoes, still angry about the inadequate equipment his men had been sent with, still angry about the promise of relief to Bataan that was never going to be kept. He said more than once, quietly, without drama, that those men deserved better than they got. He was not wrong. John Kennedy's back injury, aggravated in Blackett Strait on the night of August 1, 1943, never fully healed. He wore back braces into the Oval Office. He took corticosteroids through 2 surgeries that his staff worked to keep from public view, because in 1961, a president who appeared sick was a president who appeared weak, and weakness was not something the Cold War allowed. The coconut shell sat on his desk. It was there on November 22, 1963. When Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, the New York Times noted, among many other things, that he was the first American president to have served in a PT boat. Edgar Maurer and Gerard Zinsser, 2 of his PT-109 crew, attended the state funeral in Washington. They didn't speak publicly about what they remembered. They'd said it when it mattered. 20 years later, they stood in the cold and watched the caisson pass. And the Bataan Death March, in which somewhere between 6,000 and 18,000 Filipino and American prisoners died from execution, disease, and deliberate brutality before the march even ended, remains, to this day, a chapter of American history that most Americans know almost nothing about. Here is my final question, and this one is personal. If you had a son or a brother on those boats, on those wooden coffins with the broken torpedoes and the aviation fuel in the hull and the darkness and the destroyers, what is the one thing you would want history to remember about him? Not about the war, not about the strategy, about him specifically. Drop it in the comments. I mean it. There is a pattern that runs through American military history like a fault line through old stone. You can feel it in every chapter of this story. Time after time, in conflict after conflict, the United States enters a war with the weapons and doctrine of the last war, or the war it imagined, and meets reality on the first night of combat with something entirely different. The battleship admirals of 1941 never grasped that their era was over before their ships had fired a shot in anger. The procurement officers who certified Mark VIII torpedoes with faulty exploders hadn't seriously imagined what it would look like when men in plywood boats pulled the trigger and heard nothing. The men in the wooden coffins had no such luxury of abstraction. They thought about what the war actually looked like every night, because every night they were in it. In the dark, in the engine rooms that ran at 130 degrees, in the straits where the darkness lied to them, and the only reliable thing was the vibration of 3 Packard engines beneath their boots. They welded aircraft cannons to plywood bows. They refueled in Japanese patrolled waters from jerry cans passed by hand. They attacked destroyers with torpedoes they knew might fail, because the mission had to be done, and because the men next to them were going, and because there was nothing else to do. This is not a unique American story. It is the most consistent American story. The small unit at the edge of everything. The improvised weapon. The borrowed engine. The mechanic who'd never done it before doing it anyway. In the 82nd Airborne and the Marine Raiders and the underwater demolition teams and the PT boat squadrons, the same truth kept revealing itself. When everything fails, the men in the field improvise. They always have. They always will. The only question is whether the institution learns from them or waits for the next war to pay the same price again. The Navy fixed the torpedo problem, eventually. The doctrine of night interdiction was incorporated into post-war planning. The lessons that could be packaged and filed were packaged and filed. The other lessons proved harder. Those lessons are still being learned. In every war. On every front. By every generation that hasn't read the last one's history carefully enough to understand what it cost. The men of the PT boat squadrons held the line with what they had. They gave the war time to catch up to what they needed. They went out night after night into the black wall of Pacific water that pressed against their eyes and lied to them, into the straits full of steel ships that outweighed them 40-1 in their wooden coffins with their salvage cannons and their broken torpedoes and their malaria and their 19-year-old hands that shook when the fever spiked and steadied when the engines came up. Because the engines always came up. The Japanese called them Oni no Fune, devil boats. The Americans called them Wooden Coffins. Both names are right. The wooden coffin, the devil boat, the same 60 feet of mahogany and oak and aircraft glue and salvaged metal, the same 11 men, the same darkness. And they went out anyway. If this story stayed with you, if those 27 men at Cavite in December 1941, those sick mechanics at Tulagi, those boys who went out in the dark on a boat they called a wooden coffin, if any of them are going to stay in your memory past today, the best thing you can do right now is subscribe to this channel. Because this is what we do here. We find the stories that fell through the cracks of the history books. We say the names that didn't make the monuments. We sit with the complicated truths that easy history glosses over. Subscribe. Stay. There are a lot more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told. Back in the United States, the Navy was building more PT boats as fast as it could. What had been an overlooked program was now an industrial urgency. The Elko Naval Division in Bayonne and the Higgins Industries Yard in New Orleans were pushing boats out the doors at a pace that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. By mid-1942, new PT squadrons were commissioning every few months. Men came from everywhere: New England fishermen, Florida speedboat racers, Minnesota farm boys who had never seen salt water. The boats themselves were engineering marvels wrapped around death traps. While the admirals called them patrol boats, the men who bled in them called them plywood targets. Wooden coffins. 80 feet of highly flammable fuel and zero armor, skippered by officers who understood perfectly well what the options were if a destroyer locked them in a searchlight and opened fire at close range. The 3 Packard engines gave the boat 4,500 combined horsepower. At full throttle with a light fuel load, a PT boat exceeded 41 knots, faster than anything Japanese it was likely to encounter. But those engines ran hot, and the engine room in the tropics was something you had to experience to fully believe. 130 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 aircraft power plants running at maximum RPMs in a steel compartment not much larger than a bathroom, vibrating at a frequency that after hours felt like it was shaking your bones apart from the inside. Men who worked the engine rooms on long patrols came up on deck afterward pale and stumbling, gulping fresh air with the desperate enthusiasm of people who had nearly stopped breathing. And underneath them, in every direction, thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline. One spark, one bad weld on a fuel fitting, one near miss that shook a line loose, and that was everyone. The armament changed constantly, because the crews changed it constantly. Factory standard included 4 torpedo tubes, twin 50 caliber gun mounts, and a stern 20mm cannon. But within months of combat experience, the torpedoes, Mark the 8th models, old, unreliable, prone to running too deep in tropical water or simply failing to explode, were supplemented with whatever else the crews could find. Depth charges, 40mm Bofors guns stripped from damaged vessels, 37mm aircraft cannon from P-39 wreckage, Army bazookas on improvised deck mounts. One crew in the Solomons reportedly installed a Marine Corps flamethrower that a sympathetic gunnery sergeant had donated. The philosophy of the PT boat stated plainly, find what works, make it work faster, never stop. The Mark 8 torpedo problem was the central lie underneath everything. The torpedo ran deeper than its set depth in tropical water. The warhead's contact exploder failed on oblique hits. Sometimes they didn't detonate at all. Bulkley's men, through the Philippines campaign, reported torpedo failures in engagement after engagement. They were hitting Japanese ships. They could hear solid metal impacting hull steel, and watching nothing happen. The Navy spent most of 1942 insisting the problem was operator error. The men in the wooden coffins had known the truth from the first month. Nobody with enough rank to fix it was listening. By August 1942, the war had found its hinge point, a half-built airfield on a jungle island called Guadalcanal, in the lower Solomon Islands chain. The United States had seized it on August 7th in its first major Pacific offensive, named it Henderson Field, and immediately begun the desperate project of holding what they'd taken. What followed was 6 months of the most sustained, brutal, multi-domain fighting in American military history. The waters around Guadalcanal, a channel American sailors quickly named Iron Bottom Sound, became a graveyard for ships of both navies. The Japanese solved their supply problem with speed and darkness. Fast destroyers began running down the slot, the channel between the island chains, under cover of night, delivering troops and supplies to isolated garrisons and returning north before American aircraft could reach them at dawn. The Americans called these runs the Tokyo Express. They worked for months. PT boats were positioned at Tulagi Island in October 1942 to intercept them. 12 boats, based at a coconut plantation dock, with no real infrastructure, no dry dock, no secure supply chain, and Japanese bombing raids arriving regularly enough to be scheduled. Picture the hour before a patrol on Tulagi, October 1942. The sun has gone down the way it does that close to the equator. One moment it's there, the next the light is simply gone and the darkness comes off the water like a tide. The boats are tied at the dock, engines cold. The crews move around them in near silence, checking things they've already checked twice. Nobody talks much. There's nothing useful left to say. A torpedo man runs his hands along the exterior of the torpedo tube housing for the third time, feeling for anything wrong, any vibration, any seam that shouldn't be open. He knows what he's looking for. He checks it again anyway, because his hands need something to do. Two gunners sit on the engine hatch, smoking in total darkness. The cigarette ends glow orange. They've stopped talking about what the mission is. They know the shape of it. That's enough. In 20 minutes, the engines will be loud enough that nothing within a mile needs searchlights to find them. A motor machinist's mate from Missouri, 19 years old, is throwing up over the side of the dock. Not from seasickness. The boat isn't moving. From malaria. He's been fighting the fever since Thursday. He didn't report it. He wipes his mouth. He climbs down into the engine room. The silence before the engines roared was the hardest part. Men checking their guns for the 10th time, smoking in the dark, knowing that the next hour would either make them veterans or ghosts, knowing that the black wall of the slot out there was exactly as dangerous in both directions, and that the darkness protecting them was the same darkness hiding everything that wanted to kill them. Then the first engine turns over, and the sound takes everything else away. PT boat attacks against the Tokyo Express operated in 2 and 3 boat sections, positioned to bracket the channel. When Coast Watcher radio reports, or the radar sets on newer boats indicated Japanese destroyers inbound, the sections moved to intercept. The ideal attack was a high-speed run to close range, simultaneous torpedo launch from multiple boats to force evasive maneuvers and immediate scatter. In practice, it was considerably messier. Japanese destroyer captains adapted within weeks. They ran blacked out. They posted extra lookouts. When PT boats attacked, they turned toward, not away, coming at the smaller vessels at full speed to prevent a clean torpedo run. Japanese gunfire, guided by the white water of PT boat wakes and the muzzle flash of PT guns, was accurate enough to be lethal. On the night of November 12, 1943, PT-44 took a direct hit from a Japanese destroyer's 5-inch gun. She went down in a burning arc of aviation gasoline and splintered mahogany. Most of her crew went with her. The other 2 boats in the section continued the attack. Of 8 torpedoes fired that night, not one confirmed a hit. But the attack disrupted the delivery run enough that dawn caught the returning destroyers in range of Henderson Field's aircraft. The PT boats hadn't sunk anyone. They had, however, bought 20 minutes. And sometimes 20 minutes is the entire difference between the thing happening and the thing not happening. By the summer of 1943, the campaign had moved north along the Solomons. American forces were pressing toward Japanese strongholds at Munda and Vila. PT operations moved with them. On the night of August 1st, 1943, 15 PT boats were strung across Blackett Strait to intercept a Tokyo Express run. 4 Japanese destroyers carrying roughly 900 troops and supplies to Vila. One of the 15 was PT-109. Her skipper was Lieutenant Junior Grade John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 26 years old, son of a former ambassador, Harvard graduate, former naval intelligence officer who had used his family's connections to get a combat posting because he believed it was the right thing to do, and because in 1943, young men with fire in them wanted to be in the fight. The night was as close to absolute darkness as the tropics produce. Overcast, no moon. 15 boats scattered across miles of channel. Radar sets of varying quality. Radios that crackled with interference. Visibility essentially zero. It wasn't just a strait, it was a wall of black ink, and everything out there in it was invisible until it was already on top of you. PT-109 had been running for hours. The alertness of men past the fourth hour of darkness in combat waters has a particular quality. Not fresh alertness, but the alertness of maintenance. Watching and watching, eyes aching with it, keeping watching because stopping means something slips past. Gunner's mate. Charles Harris, crouching at his mount on the port side, said later that he'd been staring into the dark so long the darkness had started to have texture. Shapes within shapes. The night inventing things that weren't there. Kennedy was in the cockpit. McMahon was in the engine room. Most of the crew was at their stations. Then the black wall moved. The Japanese destroyer Amagiri, 2,033 tons, running at more than 30 knots, fully blacked out, materialized from the darkness at approximately 2:27 in the morning. The crew of PT-109 had between 2 and 5 seconds of warning. The collision was catastrophic. The Amagiri's bow struck PT-109 amidships on the starboard side with the full momentum of a warship at flank speed. 2 men, Marney and Kirksey, were killed instantly. The impact cut the boat nearly in half. Aviation fuel spread across the water from the ruptured tanks. The stern sank within seconds. The bow, burning, floated for a while longer. Kennedy was thrown hard against the cockpit and hit the deck. A back already damaged from a football injury at Harvard absorbed the impact. He surfaced in burning water. He called for survivors. He found 10 men alive. Several were burned. Patrick McMahon, who had been inside that engine room, that furnace when the Amagiri hit, was burned badly enough that he could not move his arms adequately to swim. What Kennedy did over the next 6 days has been told so many times, in so many ways, that the myth and the fact have become almost indistinguishable. So let me give you only the facts. He towed McMahon to the nearest island by clenching the strap of the man's life jacket in his teeth and swimming for 4 hours. He swam back out into the strait alone, at night, holding a battle lantern, hoping to flag down a passing PT boat. None came. He swam back with nothing to show for it, to an island with no fresh water and no food. He led his surviving crew from island to island over the following days. Native scouts, Byukugasa and Aroni Kumana, working with Australian coast watcher Reginald Evans, eventually made contact. Kennedy scratched a message on a coconut shell with his knife. It read, "Nauro Island, native knows position. He can pilot, 11 alive, needs small boat, Kennedy." The coconut reached Evans. The rescue was organized. On August 8, 1943, Kennedy and his surviving crew came aboard PT-157. Now here's the question historians are still arguing about, and I want your take. Some survivors and fellow officers suggested PT-109 was essentially stationary, engines disengaged for silence, when the Amagiri struck. If that's true, it's a serious tactical error. Kennedy maintained the boat was maneuvering. The official inquiry cleared him completely. Most historians accept that in the conditions of that night, 15 boats, poor communications, imperfect radar, absolute darkness, the collision was the kind of catastrophe that bad luck produces out of imperfect circumstances. But here's my question for you. Does it matter? Does how you got into the water change what you did after you hit it? Give me your honest read in the comments. Kennedy's back, injured that night in Blackett Strait, never fully healed. He wore a back brace to the White House. He took corticosteroids. He underwent surgeries. By 1963, the true state of his health was a carefully managed political question, because the president cannot appear to be a sick man, and this particular president was managing Cold War tensions that could at any moment become something considerably worse. The coconut shell sat on his desk in the Oval Office. It was there on November 22, 1963. Two of Kennedy's crew members from PT-109 attended his state funeral in Washington. They didn't speak publicly about Blackett Strait. They'd said what they had to say to the Navy investigators in 1943, when it still mattered. 20 years later, they stood in the cold outside the Capitol and watched the horse-drawn caisson pass, and whatever they were carrying, they carried it quietly. By mid-1943, the PT boat force had grown from 6 boats to more than 200. Squadrons operated from the Solomons to New Guinea to the Aleutians. The doctrine had settled around what the boats were actually good at: night interdiction, barge hunting, coastal harassment, and the slow, grinding disruption of Japanese supply lines. The 40mm Bofors cannon replaced older 20mm guns on later boats, giving crews a weapon that could reach out 4,000 yards and hit hard enough to matter. Combined with the 50 caliber mounts and whatever aircraft cannon the local mechanics had welded into place, a late-war PT boat was a genuinely formidable surface combatant for its size. The Japanese had adapted to the Tokyo Express being shut down, shifting logistics to smaller Daihatsu landing barges, 50 feet long, armored against 50 caliber fire, able to navigate shallow coastal channels where American destroyers couldn't follow. Hunting them became PT boat work, close, ugly, intimate work, the kind of fighting where you could see the faces. By the end of the Solomons campaign, the PT boat force had lost 69 boats and roughly 90 men killed in combat. These numbers look small on paper next to the casualty counts of major fleet engagements. They don't feel small when you understand that each loss was 6 or 11 men at close range, in fire and dark water, violently and suddenly. Think about those 69 boats for a moment. Every single one of them was a wooden coffin that finally delivered on the name. Every one of them had a crew that climbed in knowing exactly what they were sitting on top of. Here's a question. Of all the men in this story, Bulkley, Kennedy, the anonymous mechanics, the sick torpedoman, the 19-year-old from Georgia writing cheerful lies home to his mother, which one do you think history has forgotten that deserves to be remembered? Drop a name or a description in the comments. I read every comment on this channel. A captured Japanese officer, interrogated in late 1943, told his questioners that PT boats were more feared than American aircraft. Aircraft came in daylight, he explained. You could see them. You could prepare. The Oni no Fune, the devil boats, came in the dark, from nowhere, and were gone before you understood what had happened. The Japanese called them devil boats. The Americans called them wooden coffins. Both names were true, simultaneously. The same vessel, the same darkness, the same men. MacArthur kept his promise. On October 20th, 1944, American forces landed on Leyte Island in the Philippines. MacArthur waded ashore and said into the microphone, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The Japanese response was the largest naval engagement in the history of naval warfare, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 4 separate Japanese forces converging on the Philippines in a final desperate attempt to destroy the American invasion fleet. At Surigao Strait, the southern approach, 39 PT boats in 13 sections were waiting on the night of October 24th when the Japanese southern force entered. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers under Vice Admiral Nishimura coming down through the dark. Picture the crews of those 39 boats in the hour before the order came. They knew what was coming through. They could see it on the radar screens. 2 battleships and a cruiser screen. The math was not in their favor by any measure anyone would want to calculate. Men moving through the same rituals they'd moved through for months. Checking ammunition, checking engines, checking each other, looking for the thing in another person's face that says, I know exactly what this is, and I'm doing it anyway. Some of them were praying. Some of them were not. All of them were watching the dark. Then the orders came, and the engines came up, and the black wall of the Strait took them. They fired 34 torpedoes. One hit, PT-137's torpedo struck the heavy cruiser Mogami, damaging but not stopping her. The other attacks were deflected, evaded, or failed to detonate. By the numbers, it was a poor showing. 34 torpedoes, one hit. But the attacks illuminated the Japanese formation with flares. They forced Nishimura to keep his guns active and his captains focused on the PT boat screen for the 20 critical minutes it took to transit the gauntlet. By the time the Japanese Southern Force cleared the PT boats and entered the main strait, 6 American battleships were waiting in a line. 3 of those battleships had been on the bottom of Pearl Harbor 36 months earlier. Nevada, West Virginia, California, pulled from the mud, repaired, resurrected, sent back. And now they crossed the T on Nishimura's column. The classic naval maneuver that lets every ship in a line fire broadside against an enemy that can only fire forward. And they destroyed him. The PT boats hadn't won the battle. They'd held the door open and turned the light on until the men who could finish it arrived. Do the PT boat crews at Surigao Strait deserve credit for what happened after they cleared the way? 34 torpedoes, one hit, but 3 Pearl Harbor battleships got their revenge. Is that a PT boat victory? Tell me what you think in the comments. Every major Japanese ship that entered Surigao Strait that night was destroyed or severely damaged. The war ended on September 2nd, 1945. The Japanese surrender ceremony took place aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. PT boats were not present at the ceremony. They were already being scrapped. By early 1946, most of the Pacific PT boat fleet had been stripped, decommissioned, and disposed of, burned, sunk offshore, sold as surplus. The Elko and Higgins yards returned to civilian work. The Packard marine engine lines went out of production. The men who had crewed those boats went home, got jobs, raised families, carried their wars quietly inside them. In the space of a few years, the physical evidence of the PT boat war had nearly completely disappeared. What remained were the records and the math. And the math, examined without sentiment, doesn't tell a triumphant story. American PT boats were officially credited with sinking or severely damaging approximately 3 Japanese destroyers and 43 barges and small craft, among other actions. They disrupted supply runs, rescued downed pilots, inserted guerrilla forces, supported Coastwatcher intelligence networks that shaped air campaigns for 3 years. They also lost 69 boats and 90 men killed in combat. By the Navy's preferred calculus, tons of enemy shipping sunk per dollar spent. Enemy casualties produced per American casualty. The PT boat was a marginal weapon. It never achieved the ship-killing dominance its pre-war advocates had promised. And yet,